I'm Dave Gervich with the Iowa Falls Historical Society, and I'm sitting here this evening with Jerry Welden, who is a lifelong resident of Iowa Falls and also happens to be the mayor. It's October 7th, 2010, about 7:15 in the evening, and we're going to visit with Jerry for a few minutes and let him tell about his life here in Iowa Falls and his family. Jerry, when and where you were born? We know you were born in town, but
I was born in Iowa Falls, Iowa, in the first hospital. In the first hospital that was torn down in '36. I was born while that one was being torn down and the new one was being built. And so I don't remember much about that, though. It never comes back to me. I was born in 1936, and I'll be 75 next year. First thing I ever remember is about Iowa Falls. The first memory I have is in 1940. I can remember I was, 4 years old. I can remember standing on the corner by where the city hall is.
in there.
My first memory of Iowa Falls was when I was 4 years old. I can remember it distinctly. In 1940, Franklin Roosevelt, our president, was running for his third term, and he was being opposed by a Republican by the name of Wendell Willkie. And I can remember on the corner of Oak and Stevens and Estes, my grandmother took me up there to see Wendell coming down the street in a convertible. And I don't know why, but I can remember that. And that was my first memory, my first vivid memory. In those days, all of the candidates, the presidents on down, came to the little towns by train. We didn't have it. They were on the radio, of course, but there was no television for them to advertise on, so they advertised in person. And it was quite a deal when somebody like that came to Iowa Falls and spent a little time. My parents and a little bit about my family history. On my mother's side, her parents came from Germany, directly from Germany. And my grandfather, my mom's dad, came over here so he wouldn't have to get into the Kaiser's army, the Kaiser being the head of Germany. And he was a draft dodger, so to speak, much as many people in the United States tried to draft the Dodge during the Vietnam War. Pretty much the same thing, only he was looked at as a hero, and the draft dodgers of that Vietnam era were looked on as traitors. But nonetheless, that's why he came over here. And they ended up, for some unbeknownst reason, over in the little town of Williams, and that's where Mom grew up. Dad's family came from, we don't know where they came from. We know that they were in New York at one time and Wisconsin at one time, and then they ventured into Iowa Falls right after the Civil War. So the family's been here quite a while. I think Dad's side is German too, but he thinks it's English, and there's really no way of knowing. When I was over in Germany, I found a little town by the name of Welden that's spelled the way we spell our name. And when you go to England, you find that town, it's with an O-N. So anyhow, I think that maybe I'm all German. Don't hold that against me, but I might well be.
Just to break in here real quick, what was your dad's name and what was your mother's name?
Oh, excuse me. My dad's name was Richard Welden. They called him Dick. And Mom's name was Ruth and Dick Welden. I had one sister, Sandy, who is now Sandy Peterson, and she's married to Dick Peterson, and my wife's name is Sue, and her maiden name was Peterson also, but different vintage, different family. So my wife, Sue, and we had Sue, this is our second marriage. Sue had 3 children. One of whom is deceased, and I had 8 children, so there's 10 surviving children between us, and they're scattered hither and yon, doing this and that and the other thing. My dad had two sisters and a brother who had between them, I think, like 7, 10 kids, all cousins, of course. And my mother had 2 brothers, so they're just the 3 in that family.
Can you give us their names?
I can give you their names. It was Carl Wackel and George Wackel.
Okay.
And my dad's relative or siblings were Bob Welden, who lived here in Iowa Falls, and Rosemary and Janet. And they moved out of the territory when they were quite young and lived all over the United States.
Since you were born in '36, you were a child growing up here, 8, 9, 10 years old during World War II. What
Yeah.
was it like in Iowa Falls
In World War II.
at home here during World War II?
You know, I have a lot of memories about World War II, even though I was just a child. I was only 10 years old or 9 years old when it was over, but I remember a lot about it. I remember going to school. Well, number one, Dad worked out of state for defense projects in Nebraska and South Dakota. And so when I was in 2nd grade, I attended 3 schools during 2nd grade out in Omaha and Council Bluffs and whatnot. And when I came back into 2nd grade in Iowa Falls, I never learned the alphabet till I was in 6th grade, because when I was in 2nd grade, everybody else learned it. But I kept moving from school to school, and nobody ever bothered to teach it to me. But I can remember in 2nd grade, we had a teacher of the name of Mrs. Haskins. Real nice looking young lady. And her husband was a pilot in World War II in a B-17, and he was killed. And I can remember vividly her walking down between the desks with a picture of her husband, her late husband, showing him to us. And things like that stick with you. In World War II, my 2 uncles from Williams, George and Babe, Carl's name was Babe, they were in New Guinea, and they served 4 years in the South Pacific during the war. I can remember in school during World War II, you wrote on both sides of the paper. Paper was rationed, was scarce. We had to write on both sides. I can remember the Japanese took an island called the Kapok Islands, and the Kapok Islands were named after a weed that grew there, a plant, and the kapok was used to make life preservers. Well, the Japanese invaded the Kapok Islands, took over the kapok, so we didn't have any materials for life jackets. And they decided that they could use milkweed pods for life jackets, to make life jackets out of the seeds or the fluff inside of the pod. And I can remember that in the spring when the milkweeds would come out, they would have a contest to see who could go out and pick the most milkweeds and bring them back to school. Dad and Uncle Bob had a pasture out in the country, and it was just full of milkweed pods. Milkweeds, and Dale Camel and I, God bless him, I heard from him the other day, Dale Camel and I would go out there with our gunny sacks and fill them up with milkweed pods. In the winter, got a half a day off school. So we always got a half a day off school for 2 or 3 years there during the war. But I can remember that. I can remember the airplanes flying over. I remember rationing. Everything was rationed. Tires, cars. We had artificial soles in our shoes, artificial rubber. And your mom make you take it off the minute you came in the house, take your shoes off, because the rubber would leave marks on the wooden floors, and you couldn't get the marks off. But I can remember one time, it was either VE Day or VJ Day. That VE was Victory in Europe, which was in '45, early '45, and Victory in Japan, VJ Day, was later in 1945. But I can remember one of those two, I can't remember which one it was. We had a humongous bonfire downtown, right, probably blocks east of the main drag, 2 blocks east of, 1 or 2 blocks east of Oak Street. And I can remember that on Washington Avenue. And they had crates and boxes and logs, and this fire was just shooting up in the air, and men were throwing their hats in the fire. The war was over, you know. We finally can come back to everything being normal again, maybe not. Rationing, food rationing, sugar was the big thing. Sugar was rationed, and I remember one time I set up a Kool-Aid stand, and I shouldn't have done that because I sold a lot of Kool-Aid because it was real good Kool-Aid, and the reason it was real good Kool-Aid is I used up my mother's entire monthly allocation of sugar to make the Kool-Aid. I can remember that too, yes. And about that time, right after the war, I had I can remember very vividly, just coming to think of it, when Franklin Roosevelt died. It's funny these things you remember.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember I had a newspaper out, the Des Moines Register Tribune. I did the Tribune, but on Sunday we had to do the Sunday papers too. And I can remember, I don't remember if it was a Sunday or not, that doesn't make any difference, but I can remember doing my newspaper route, and I met a girl by the name of Jean Flower, and she had a newspaper route too, and we kind of crossed paths, and I remember her telling me that the president had died, and the president died, and that was in 1944? 45, and well, that's one of the things from the war I remember. Another thing I remember from the war, we had prison camps around here for German prisoners. And the main camp was up in Algona, and there was a sub-camp in Eldora. And they would drive the prisoners by our house out on Washington Avenue, which was also Highway 20. And I remember one day, I could still see them going by, this truck load of prisoners, German prisoners, and one of them lost their cap. And man, I ran out there and I globbed onto that cap. I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And I'd really found a treasure. Well, it had the swastika on it, the German eagle and everything. Well, my mother made me throw it out because it was a German hat, and we're not going to have any German hats in our house. And so that was the end of my German hat collection. I've collected a lot of German stuff since, but that was the end of that one.
What kind of things did you do when you were growing up as a child in a early, 12, as a child, and when you hit your early teens? I mean, what kind
You aren't going to tell my mom and dad, are you?
No.
Okay.
We'll keep it quiet.
Oh gosh, I was in every trouble you could get into. What did we do? Well, I know a lot of things we didn't do. We didn't sit around and play with electronic games and everything. We listened to the radio a lot. We listened to the radio. You just can't imagine the imagery in your mind when you're listening to the radio and you can't see any characters. The only thing you can do is hear the words and the sound effects, like the clippity-clop of the horses and stuff like that. And so we listened to the radio a lot, read a ton of comic books, played baseball. We played a lot of baseball.
Really?
And of course there was, in the wintertime we ice skated on the river a lot.
Where? Just everywhere?
Most of it was down by the boat club. They had an area they always cleaned off. But of course we didn't have snowmobiles then and whatnot, so the ice would never get disturbed once it was cleaned off. And so it was good for the whole year. We also went to movies. Saturday afternoon was movie day. They had cowboy movies, Roy Rogers and Howlong Cassidy and Tom Hanks, all of those rough riding, Gene Autry. Oh yes. And Well, let's see, what else did we do?
What about life in the summertime on the river? Did you spend much in the summertime? Did you?
I did a lot of fishing. Kids
Okay.
fished a lot. I remember fishing down at Foster Park.
Okay.
In those days, Foster Park was kind of isolated. The only way to get down to Foster Park in those days was to go down Dale Drive, and that was all cornfields between Highway 20 or Washington Avenue and Foster Park. Just one great big cornfield. Foster Park was where I smoked my first cigarette. Yeah, amongst other things down there. And we did a lot of fishing. Did a lot of swimming in the river. Even though we had a swimming pool in Iowa Falls, same place this one is, only this is the pool that's there right now in 2010 is the third pool on that site.
Okay.
I can remember the first pool. We'd go over there and the trains went right by there as they do today, but in those days the trains were coal-fired. And of course they made a lot of soot, black smoke and soot. And whenever the train came by, everybody went under the water because all of this black smoke was belching and all the soot would fall in the swimming pool. Those were the days. And yeah, we did a lot of swimming. In the river we did a lot of jumping off what they call Suicide Cliff, which is on the top side of the swinging bridge on the east side of the river across from Baptist Assembly Grounds. Well, that was another thing. That was Baptist Assembly Grounds is where, what's the name of that park now? Assembly Park. And that was a campgrounds for the Baptists. And the kids came there and they closed that in, I don't know, the 50s, probably early 50s, and deeded it over to the city as for a park. And it's been a good park for the city. What else did we do? Like I say, we played a lot of baseball. Did a lot of, the kids made up a lot of, I can remember playing Annie Over and things like that, you know. Staying out night. Oh gosh, we'd go play cops and robbers and go on camping trips. Clear out to Georgetown, which was, what, half a mile out of town?
Right. Yeah.
and spend the night. If you had enough gumption, you'd spend the night out there.
Okay, let's cut her off here for a minute.
Okay, here we are again. Another thing I remember from my younger days was the circuses. There were the circuses and the carnivals that would come to town. That was always a big deal, and we had the circuses and the carnivals in those days would show up, and by train, the circuses